Okay, so welcome. Thank you again for doing this. I don't want to, I want to start in with the questions so that I can have as much time as possible with you for that.
Sure. Thanks for
Um,
having me.
yes, thank you so much for agreeing. It's really nice to know that we have all these other things in common as well. Um, so I'm just going to dive into the first question that is related to our podcast name, which is what does seem like magic to you?
I think what seems like magic to me is language acquisition, specifically language acquisition in children. I have two young children right now, and so every day I get to watch them develop their verbal toolkit a little bit more, not always in ways that I like, but it takes me back to my own experience learning English as a child, and it's, you know, I couldn't articulate how it happened. Just I landed in the US, and 3 months later, I was speaking English. And in the meantime, I was mute. And so some very interesting cognitive processes are at play there.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. What because we have your professional bio, but what was your experience learning English?
I landed in the US on a Saturday, and I was in my first day of first grade that next Monday. And didn't really have, I mean, this was first grade, and so it's not like I'd had a lot of academic instruction in English up until then. And so really it was just, like a pure experiment in language immersion. And I don't really have a lot of concrete memories of it just because it was so long ago. I was so young. But I mean, I know my mother loves to tell a story about how the teacher reached out and said, I think we're going to have to hold him back, not because they didn't think I was keeping up, but just because I wasn't talking. And so I wasn't giving any indication or evidence that I was understanding or grasping any of the concepts. And then by Thanksgiving, she says one day I got on the phone and she was just amazed to hear me start speaking English. And so her theory is, and this sort of squares with what's happened since then, is that I was just such a perfectionist that I didn't want to learn through trial and error. I just wanted to sort of take it all in and not unleash my English on the world until I knew I was ready, or until I felt confident.
So you went there, and this was 3 months after you landed. With Thanksgiving was 3 months
That,
later.
that's what she tells me. And so I like to say that as a perfectionist, acting as an interpreter, working as an interpreter is like exposure therapy for imperfection. And so I think I would actually be really poorly suited for being a translator because, as a translator, you can just sit there all day agonizing over a sentence, but interpretation is in the moment, and you don't have time to hold on to a mistake or stress about something.
Yeah, that's so right. um, and that really meshes your experience with language meshes with mine because I went to Brazil not knowing any Portuguese when I was 8, and we went in September, but I went to the Southern Hemisphere, so they were ending
Mm-hmm.
their school year. So I actually had just started second grade. No, I had just started third grade. Well, I would have started third grade in the United States. I think I went for 2 weeks and then moved to Brazil, and so I finished second grade in Portuguese. So that was kind of nice that I got that. I didn't have to really be learning. And same thing, I didn't um, I didn't understand anything. I think I spoke though. I had never heard that I was mute. I probably never have been, but it took about 3 months, and then it's just like, whoa, it's all there. And meanwhile, my mother's barely functioning in Portuguese, so it really is an incredible experience. And that full immersion, what does it. You realize when you're a
Mm-hmm.
child, it's like when you're born, and it's just that full on exposure, which is really amazing to see with your own kids. That's cool. I didn't get to see that. um what do you say, so what is, when you do introduce yourself professionally to someone, what is the short version of what you say? What do you tell us what you do?
I would say my bread and butter is court interpreting. And so that's what I initially started working in, and that's been the bulk of my work. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of interpreting in the media, a little bit of conference, a little bit of medical, a little bit of translation. The translation and the medical mostly come as offshoots of legal things that I'm involved in. But that's the bulk of my work. And so right now, because court has slowed down, I have the opportunity, and it was a really good 1-2 sort of punch. At the same time that court slowed down, I was able to get this steady gig interpreting on TV, and so it's worked out very nicely, because in normal circumstances it would be really hard for me to every day set aside 2 hours in the morning and commit to being somewhere. Just freelancer's dilemma.
Right, right. So tell me about what you've been doing for PBS in Iowa.
We're going on a month now that we have been live on the air with the governor for her daily press briefings. That's every day at noon Eastern. And so folks that are tuned in here locally can turn on the SAP secondary audio on their TV, and then, they see the governor and they see her lips moving, but they hear our voices. And that's also then grown into a few other shows that we do. There's a local political talk show where they have different guests, different government officials and journalists. And so we do that on Fridays. And then tonight we have our first political debate. That show, Iowa Press, is hosting a debate for the Democratic Senate candidates for the primary. There's a primary coming up here in a few weeks. And so that's going to be my first time doing a political debate. I've done a little bit of political work for radio, but never the back and forth. And, you've got to be ready with the applause lines and the zingers. And so that's going to be what I'm sort of churning in the back of my head the rest of the day, is trying to get ready for that.
So how do you prepare differently for this type of job than you did when you were working in court primarily?
That's a really good question. Court, at least what I usually do, can be pretty formulaic. If you're used to working with the same judges, and if you're used to working the same types of hearings, you get used to, you go in for a guilty plea and you already have the schema in your head that's going to start with getting the person's background, and then explaining their rights, explaining what it means to plead guilty, and then what's going to happen later on in the case. And so, at this point, 10 years in, 11 years into that, I don't do a lot of preparation. For sure, if I come across a word that I'm not familiar with, I write it down and I try to look it up, and there's just not a lot of that anymore. And so this has been wonderful, because it's keeping me hungry. It's keeping me on the edge, because it's totally different. And the performative aspect has been what's really pushed me, because in court, mostly you have an audience of one. If you're working simultaneously into Spanish, your audience of one is the defendant. And, they're not giving you a thumbs up, thumbs down based on your delivery and intonation. And so, broadcasting out to an audience, or then something that's going to get streamed on Facebook for thousands. We're getting thousands of views every day on these videos that are stored, archived, and then put up on the Iowa PBS Facebook page. And so, the Iowa PBS YouTube, and then local Spanish media are embedding them on their Facebook pages. And so that's something that, if I go back at the end of the day and I listen to myself and I sound breathy and I sound hurried and I don't sound like I'm giving a good delivery, that's something that I really take to heart and try to work on. And so something that I do for this that I don't do for court is that I practice and I listen, specifically working on delivery and pacing and breathing, which is, like I said, I haven't approached court as a performative act. Maybe I should more, except being in front of a jury. That's different. But this is almost entirely performative, but you need to also be on top of the vocabulary. And so it's interesting someday, when this is all long behind me, I want to go back and listen to the first few days, which now would be really traumatic, because the first few days, it sounds like crash course for court interpreter doing conference, trying to get out of trouble by going fast, not as familiar with the terminology. But after a few days, we got a feel for the terminology. And after about a week and a half, I started to figure out it matters how, it's not moving the needle at all to just go fast and get everything in. It's better to sound good and be able to effectively summarize, so you're still capturing the meaning, but it sounds appealing. A friend of mine who is a very experienced conference interpreter and actually a trained actor, He was very Socratic. I asked him to give me some feedback, and he didn't actually give me feedback. He just asked me a lot of questions. But his first question to me was, pretend that I am the producer and that you are the point person for the interpreting team. What are my asks of you? What are my requests? And I got it right away. So it's not like I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. It's just still the matter of developing that instinct and developing conditioning, getting out of those habits from court. And so what I needed to be doing, or what I still need to be doing, is number one, it needs to sound good. It's got to be pleasant for the viewer so that they don't tune in and say, I'm interested in this topic, but this person sounds like they are running a marathon while they're interpreting. And number two, you've got to capture the meaning, and there's got to be substance to it that squares with what's being put out. That does not mean interpreting every single hedge and false start and, duplicated adjective. And so that's the difference from court.
Right, right. Yeah. And that'll be interesting to see when you go back to doing a lot of court too. I
Yeah,
wonder.
and you know what? I went back, actually. I have continued occasionally to do court stuff during the course of this past month remotely, and I do notice a difference working on my décollage and allowing myself a longer décollage. And so it's been a pure net positive. I think I had finished just, that the two things that I'm starting to understand intellectually and occasionally execute on the mic in these things is, and I had the chance the other night to get on with Steve Mines and run through something, because the one of the shows that we taped on Friday morning was actually working off of tape. It was something that had been taped the day before. And I think they actually had the notion to have us interpret once it had been taped. They thought, let's have them come in and do this. And so I had the great advantage of having my script in front of me, having the audio to run through the night before. And, the feedback I got was, you sound like a court interpreter. So that was something that I was able to try to, take in and then come back the next day and try to sound better.
Yeah. And it's good feedback that they knew to say that, but that's not necessarily, that's hard to hear, but.
Absolutely. No, because you know what, I listen, and that's why it's so valuable to listen to yourself. I listen to myself and I take away the same impression. And so you've got to embrace the struggle
Mm-hmm.
to really improve. And I'm more than willing to do that. Now, I'm not sharing the links to the YouTube playlist just yet, but publicly, but I think we will eventually.
Yeah, I think that's really important what you just said in terms of embracing the struggle and being, really be open to the feedback and to getting better and to knowing, like.
Yeah. I mean, and I seek it out. I know who among my colleagues is more experienced in this conference mode and who's going to give me good feedback. And so that's been really valuable. And when you're hearing the same thing from multiple people, there's something to it. So, I had moments on Friday. I had a few moments where I felt pretty in tune, where I was on point with the message and was delivering it clearly, a little too clearly, actually. If you listen on the mic, I can send this to you just for fun. If you listen to the recording, you can actually hear me pounding my fist against my palm to emphasize a point, because the governor was getting really worked up about something. She was not to that level of worked up, but I was really trying to. And that's, from my experience, there's something I like about conference, which is in court, it's usually so buttoned up. And especially up at the witness stand in front of a jury, I've been told by my partners that I gesticulate too much. And so I sometimes have to interpret literally with my off hand under my leg to keep it from moving around. And I keep one hand free to write, to take notes. But when I got into a booth, maybe one of my first jobs that I was really doing in a booth, that's your little universe. And so being free to gesticulate and do whatever without anybody being upset was nice for me. So I appreciate that they are very different modes of working. And so you just have to be able to sort of switch. I wish it were like a phone. I wish it were like a SIM card that I could just take out and insert the conference skill set.
Yes, that would be nice. So, when I started doing these interviews, and designing, kind of thinking about why to talk about remote interpreting. It was just at the very beginning of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And as it evolves, some of them even seem, not quite well placed. But um, just remind me, had you worked at all remotely before COVID? Like, had you done any kind of experimenting or work where you were working remotely, either VRI, OPI, or RSI?
I had for sure done OPI, just because by the nature of some of the court work I do, sometimes an attorney from out of state is allowed to appear by phone, and so, or they need to talk to someone at the jail, and so I'm at the jail with maybe a probation officer, and the attorney calls in, and so we're working off of a speakerphone there on the table. That could be one example. Or my local federal district court does a little bit of video that they're able to fuse with their audio system in the courtrooms. And so I have actually done remote simultaneous over video from the courthouse out to a defendant, half a state away. And so I had experience with that, but the pandemic has really forced me to take that to another level. When that becomes your sole source of work, that's something that you've got to really, I don't want to say adapt or die, because this is not hopefully going to go long enough that anybody would literally starve from not being able to work remotely, but it definitely, being able to adapt has allowed me to stay active.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you find that works well in remote? Is there something that actually is better or that works particularly well because you're interpreting remotely now?
Well, I think it's important to have flexibility in problem solving. And so I'll give you a really good example. As of the middle of March, myself, attorneys, basically anybody was no longer allowed into the jail here. The jail here in Des Moines, Polk County, has a pretty bad COVID outbreak at the moment. But even before then, preemptively, they said, that's it, we're shutting down. And so if you want to talk to your clients, to the attorneys, if you want to talk to your clients, you're going to have to do it by phone, or you're going to have to do it by video. And so the jail had a pre-existing video visiting system. That's the way people speak to their families, because they don't allow people to come in physically. They never did, even before this. And so I went ahead and created an account on there, because I said, you know what, I don't know how many hearings they're going to have. And in fact, the number of hearings, the number of cases, anything that they can put off, they have. They're really only doing the essential stuff. And I don't have a monopoly on that either. There's another federal interpreter here who gets their share of the cases. And so in anticipation of seeing us decline in that in-court work, whether remote or in person, I went ahead and created an account for myself. And I had an interesting experience actually trying to negotiate the bureaucracy of the jail, because they had a really rigid position, which was the only person within the system who is granted confidential status, meaning they are not going to have their video calls monitored for attorney-client privilege purposes, would be an attorney. And so that doesn't work for me, because I am on there facilitating that conversation. I'm basically acting as the conduit for privileged communication. And so those are some pretty philosophical, kind of deep points that are hard to square with a bureaucracy that says, well, no, look at it, it's written right there, attorneys only. And so I was anticipating actually a lot more of a fight for that, but they might have just gotten tired of getting emails from me. And so eventually they never actually said, we will grant you this. But after I wrote a somewhat impassioned email, they just said, okay, give us your email. And after that, it was set. And so now I'm able to do video visits and have them not be monitored. And now I have confidential status, despite the fact that I am not an attorney. So that's an interesting example of an adaptation, and something that you've got to be mindful of. But going back to that system, that is a fixed system. That is as rigid as they come. You have no choice whether you're going to use it or not. If you want to talk to your client by video, that is what you are using. And it does not allow, you can't mute yourself on it. You can't shut off your video on it. And so we did eventually come up with a way to do simultaneous through it, but it took a lot of thinking and experimentation. And so I was very fortunate to be working with a younger attorney, and it's not strictly young people that know how to do this, but with a younger attorney who was pretty tech savvy, and who I think even he might have had the idea to get on the video call, but then he would mute himself and he would silence his computer, because you can system level on a Windows and probably on a Mac too, mute your microphone. And so he was on the video call, but he was deaf and dumb for video call purposes. And then we had a phone connection, he and I, to communicate back and forth. And so it was sort of like a relay. I was, purely speaking, the intermediary, right? Because he couldn't hear or say anything to his client, and vice versa. His client couldn't see or hear anything that he was saying. But I was able to do simultaneous because I was getting my input from the attorney from the phone and going out into the mic, which, by the way, I do have a mic. I have a table mic, which we're not using today because it was sounding a little scratchy, but I want to say for anybody judging, I know that the earbuds are not a best practice, but today it is what worked. And I think that underlines our point, which is it's important to be flexible and problem solve. So that's an example. So that was a really long-winded way of saying it's important to be to have that problem-solving skill set and to be flexible. Because it's not essential to do simultaneous on those, but they are time limited. That's another thing, that you're working with a rigid system where you're on the clock. There's a countdown at the top right of the screen once you get on. And so just for the attorney, that benefits the attorney, because for their purposes, they're getting more bang for their buck out of that visit by just being able to communicate more and not have to wait for interpretation.
Mm-hmm. So am I hearing that in addition to, it's good to have that adaptability and that flexibility, but also that because it was a new thing that everyone, was forced to do, you were able to change something that in the past was very fixed, right? It sounds like before you would have had to done this one way, and now you were able to do it simultaneously.
Correct. Well, before, everything that we're doing over video, historically, we would have been just doing in person.
Right.
And so the big question for me, and I think that everybody is wondering, is how much of this sticks once we're able to go back into the jail, once we're able to have people in court. And so it's good future proofing to invest in the skill set now in case a lot of it sticks after, right, or some of it.
Right.
And so, and I will say that the caveat for that system or that setup with the jail videos with the telephone parallel is I do have to mute myself at least one way. I have to mute myself on the phone to be doing simultaneous over the computer connection. And then I wouldn't necessarily have to mute myself the other way if I were just doing consecutive from Spanish into English. I could, and I sometimes have, but I know a lot of people get upset about that because cognitive load and it's an additional burden. It's an additional task that you've got on top of what you're already doing, which is pretty taxing, in interpreting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, there is that additional load, which, today on an assignment I was doing, which was similar in that I had, one set of microphone and headphones for the source audio, and then another one for my microphone.
Yeah.
You have to learn. Yeah. And I had 3 screens plus my phone to communicate with the interpreter. You have to manage everything else. And actually it was a setup where there's a longer meeting that 2 interpreters are doing. And this was for an hour and a half of that longer meeting, I was working with one of those interpreters, and the other interpreter was working with another interpreter in a different meeting. This is what the client wanted. And so it came time for me to be done, and the other interpreter wasn't on yet. And he was to take over for the rest of the day working with this other person. And he wanted to do the chat in a different Zoom than I had been doing it already. And and it was one of those things that I was like, yes, it could be done. But then my partner, who's been using this and is now used to it for an hour and a half, like the cognitive load, it's reduced in that sense because now we know where we chat and where we listen and I don't want to change him up because that's going to be too much for him to do in the middle of the meeting now to new partner, I have to go to a different chat box. So.
Right. And these are the situations that we find ourselves in, right? Because what I've described to you as far as the jail, it's it's a little bit of juggling, but relatively speaking, it's a discrete, limited in scope subject matter. There's only two people. I'm facilitating a conversation that is one-to-one. And so trying to do this with, and it's just me. And so trying to do this with a team interpreter, with multiple participants, with multiple speakers potentially, the degree of difficulty really goes up. And so that's where the skill set you build up trying to kind of hack, in quotation marks, a phone video system, you can apply that then to a higher level challenge, which would be something like this. An example is Zoom simultaneous, because Zoom simultaneous is something else that when the pandemic started, it came on my radar, and I thought, let's get on here and start playing around with it. And so I was very intrigued by it. And so I started to get a feel for it, and I started to get a feel for some of the bugs and some of the challenges of it, and then workarounds and ways to avoid them, to the point where I was able to start using it. You know, I've even posted pictures, screenshots with permission of some of the work that I've done with that. And attorneys are thrilled with it, but it takes a lot of work to get it up and running. And one of the issues with it is that it does have a simultaneous mode, and it will allow two interpreters on a channel, but the interpreters can't hear each other. And so that's an example of where if you are locked into using that platform, you've got to find some sort of a workaround. And communicating with your partner is an issue, like you said, where you can do it through the chat or you can do it through some other means.
Right. Yeah. And one last thing about what you were saying from the jail with the setup, and how you mentioned it could be something that could stick, and we don't know how much of these changes are going to become more permanent.
Mm-hmm.
It did sound like, to a certain extent, if the time that the inmates have is limited with their attorney, and you're able to do simultaneous, then they're actually
Mm-hmm.
able to have more talk time, right? Because you're not doing consecutive.
Yeah, absolutely. Because here's the thing. It might be that once this is over, the only way we're able to do simultaneous in those client meetings is through that video system, because to do simultaneous in person, you need to bring in equipment, and there are regulations at the jail against bringing in. And that's another situation where you've got to square the bureaucratic mentality of, the rule says this, no electronics, with this is being used for a professional purpose to facilitate attorney-client consultation. And so they do occasionally let me in with permission. I say, can I bring in and I don't even use a transmitter. I use a stereo amplified listener, which is a device that people who are hard of hearing would stick next to their TV. It basically conceptually operates like a stethoscope. Whatever you say into the end of it is amplified out to the person hearing it. And so that's what I would use. And for example, for law enforcement interviews or for something that's going to be really long, I'll ask permission. But, I'm in and out of there enough that I'm not going to be asking them, and I don't want to try to sneak it in. And so the reality is, after this is done, it'll be an interesting conversation to have with those attorneys. And it might be that they say, you know what, we've got a lot to cover, and so let's do this on the video so that we can do it simultaneously and cover more. And it's not a magic solution. The audio quality coming back from the folks at the jail can be really spotty, because I see them on a handset. They're on a phone, but sometimes it still is ambient audio. And so, it's like I said, it's not a magic solution, but it's been really interesting to play with. And that's a skill set then that I can apply to talking through the local court, who's been experimenting with Cisco Jabber, which is a static video platform. They now have Zoom. They got a Zoom Gov subscription to be able to do Zoom simultaneous, but they're actually opting to just do static Zoom with no simultaneous with a phone run in parallel. Because initially they were not allowing phones at the jail, and now they are. And so today actually will be my debut on that, my maiden voyage on that system. But I feel fine with it, because we've already been doing some hearings using a parallel phone connection from the courtroom. And so I'm physically there in the courtroom, which solves a lot of issues, because I can get my sound from the judge and the attorneys ambiently, and they can get my sound. I just lean into the microphone. And so half of the problems that you would have are taken care of right there. And so basically my phone becomes my transmitter, my my earpiece becomes my microphone.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of it's every time I talk to someone, it's like more details and like more setups. You know, the hybrid. It's like, what do you even call them? Just with all the elements involved, right?
Right. And it's and you can rack your brain about like it's sort of remote on one half of it because I'm not with the person listening to me, but it's not remote in that I'm sitting there in front of the judge. And I'm doing it over the phone, but there's a video connection. And so I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting debate, but I don't know where that really gets you to put a label on it. I mean, it's this hybrid system, and it's what we're doing to try to keep things moving along. And I get paid on a flat rate, whether it's 0 hours or 4 hours. And so I'm happy to do it and to not have to be there an hour for something that should take 20 minutes.
Right, right. Speaking of labeling, do you have a preference, or what do you call it? You know, in terms of, are we doing remote interpreting? Some people are calling it virtual, online, distance. In Europe, I think they call it distance interpreting.
Right. I honestly, I leave the labeling up to others because I've had those conversations where I describe the video hybrid phone system and they say, oh, but that's not RSI. I say, okay, then we've got to call it something else, but that's what we're doing. And I like the intellectual challenge of trying to think through, how to set it up and how to make it work. And if something goes wrong, how to do it better. And so, like I said, I don't concern myself with the labels as much.
Yeah, and I think it really is an add-on value. It's an added value that you give your clients.
Hmm.
You know, to have that technical expertise, to have the technical expertise to enjoy doing. It sounds like you enjoy figuring it out, um, and to be willing to do it. You know, to and not really
Absolutely.
impose. And then the fourth thing is to, yeah, you can call it what, we'll call it whatever you want.
Yeah. And there's a line there between value added service within interpreting and then taking on additional responsibilities for no more money. And so I'm willing to do that in court because it serves my purpose in doing simultaneous and getting out of there faster for doing the same job. When you're talking about, oh, what would it be, RSI or whatever you call Zoom simultaneous, which some people don't consider RSI, purely speaking. Um, when you're talking about the interpreter also basically acting as the tech, also acting as the host, then you're getting into, okay, how do you properly quote and ask to be compensated for this service? Because that really is beyond the scope of your responsibilities. And so I think if you can properly articulate what the value of that is, then you should be able to ask for more from your client, and whether they do it or not is another story. But it's a good conversation to have, and it's something good for us to start discussing as well, because the situation with Zoom simultaneous, and the reason we're giving this webinar tomorrow for the University of Arizona is it's a great tool, and so people see it and say, oh, hey, cool, yeah, I want to do that, but they don't understand the complexity of everything that goes in from setting it up and activating it to then actually running it and troubleshooting it. And so you can get in not a lot of trouble. I mean, what you have a failed meeting, okay, but you can have issues and have technical problems if you just go into it blindly. And if the interpreter doesn't know how to run it really well and the client doesn't really know how to run it really well, you're kind of dead in the water. And I know colleagues have had issues where, they get in and the client called them in, said, hey, can you log on? And we're going to try to do this interpretation, but they hadn't actually set it, because that's something you can't just do it. You don't go into a meeting and say, Siri, turn on simultaneous. You've got to set it in your account, and then you've got to set it when you're scheduling that specific meeting to even be able to do it. And then without that, there's no solution. You've got to shut it down, go back into the settings and activate it. And so they had, that was a dud meeting. They were not able to do simultaneous on that. And so that's what I'm really working on right now, is thinking through my messaging to clients from even the first conversation where we're deciding what we're going to use. And so since I mostly work in legal, I'm not getting remote work for international conferences or, meeting with delegates. We're talking depositions, mediations. And so it's a fair use of Zoom simultaneous. I think that's not too big a job for that as a tool, but you still need to have some conversations with the client up front to say, listen, if you and your client are going to want to listen in different languages, you need to each be on a device. And if you're going to be in the same room, you need to each be on headphones. Otherwise, your sound is going to leak out onto his microphone. Things like that. And sort of being proactive in addressing issues to avoid having a failed meeting. We had, through my partner that I'm doing these jobs with, a couple of weeks ago, we did a Zoom gig where our input was Zoom, everybody was connected to Zoom, but we were interpreting over the phone. And we were interpreting via a conference line that they set up for people to call in and listen. And initially there was a discussion of doing Zoom simultaneous. And I said, we can just say no, because I knew that it wasn't going to work. They were expecting to have 500 people. And I had my misgivings, but I said, you know what, let's talk about it some more. And they actually proposed, let's have a run through. Let's get on, the two of you, the interpreting team, and the two of us, the organizers, let's get on a Zoom call and we'll try out this simultaneous, right? Among two people who were listening to us, we couldn't get both of them to correctly launch Zoom simultaneous and get them into a language channel. And so if that's not going to work with two, how's it going to work with 500? And so, but it was that experience that really got the buy-in from the client to where they saw very clearly, okay, this is not the right tool for this, rather than us having to say, no, we're not doing this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you brought up several of those points, because you're right. The added value is something that you have and you want to think about when you're, where do I fit in, among other interpreters. But at the same time, yeah, if the client is just taking from you but still wants to pay you the same as they did when someone else was managing everything, someone else is setting up the booth for you, someone else was then,
and I will say this, the most stressful job I've had on Zoom was unpaid, because it was pretty early in my journey, as it were. And so I was willing to do it to get experience interpreting live on Zoom. And because I hadn't had that experience, I went along with some things that I probably shouldn't have. And it was very, very stressful. But we got through it. And so it was sort of a stress test of this was with a partner, with Amy Benavides, who I'm going to be doing the presentation with tomorrow, along with Tamber Hilt. It was a stress test of our knowledge of Zoom. And so in a way it was empowering, because despite the intense stress and sort of drama, we got through it. We knew what to do. But it was an issue of we were trying to do team interpreting. We were trying to do a handoff and it wasn't working. And the means of troubleshooting in Zoom interpreting is you've got to be host and not co-host. You've got to be host. Zoom interpreting, Zoom simultaneous is a monotheistic religion. There is only one host that is going to have any control over the settings, over anything. And so we had somebody hosting that meeting who is not who we had done the practice with, who is not who we had trained. And so they were struggling to make us host. We were struggling to communicate with them because this was a political town hall that was online. And so multiple people from the campaign logged on under the same account. And so they had the same name as the participants. And so we didn't even know who to be sending these frantic pleas to. And so I'm trying to troubleshoot over chat while I'm actively interpreting on the mic. And you can imagine, like, the cognitive load, my stress level was off the charts, but we got through it. And then we knew, and you know what? The next week they came back to me and they asked me back and they offered. I didn't even have to say, we're only going to do this again if you pay me. They came back to me and they said, we would like you back and we want to pay you. And I knew, what do we need to do on the front end? What do I need to train them on? What do I need to really clearly message? And I think we've done 2 more events with them and it's been smooth sailing after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really important. I wrote something for the ATA on kind of tips, and it's for clients. It's tips for clients on how to work with interpreters, and that was one of them. Like, you have to have a rehearsal, you have to have a dry run, and it has to be with everyone in the same roles, using the same devices. Everything has to be the same, because I had a failed meeting too, where an organization that I had worked with in person, and tried really hard to get them to do voice boxer. And they wouldn't do it. This was also in the very, very beginning, and so I think I
Mhm.
spent too much time trying to get them on board for voice boxer, and they didn't want to do it. They wanted the Zoom RSI had just come out, Zoom simultaneous, and we did a rehearsal, and it never worked. We did 2 rehearsals, none of them ever worked, and they still were like, okay, we're gonna, and me and the other interpreter, because it was also for 2 different languages. Yeah, and at their meeting, 15 minutes before start, they couldn't designate us as interpreters. They didn't know how to do it. They weren't, so it was just,
And then that was on what platform that they ended up using?
they went with Zoom, with the Zoom simultaneous, but they, clearly
I bet
didn't know the controls.
yeah. And that's the thing. If you as the interpreter can bring that to the table to where you can troubleshoot for them, I mean, that gets you out of the jam, but what you really want is to have that control ahead of time to put that in place, right? And to say, you know what, I'll host through my Zoom account, pay me an extra however much. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's one of the recent, I'm approaching 10 paid jobs that I've done on Zoom simultaneous, which is not a lot in the big scheme of things, but I mean, it's more than I think most have done at this point, because a lot of people are familiar with it, but not a lot. I don't know that a lot of people are actually using it a lot to work. And just about every time I have something comes up, there's some even a minor issue. The other day it was the court reporter got on ahead of time, and I was thrilled because she was the one who I hadn't really been able to talk to ahead of time, because it was through an agency, and so all of my communication technical specs that I sent went through the agency, and so she got on early, and I was thrilled. I said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to turn this on. You're not going to see the icon yet, but in a minute you're going to see the globe. Click on it, select English, and then I'm going to be the interpreter, and I'm going to be speaking into the English channel, and you tell me if you can hear me. If you can hear me, then we're good. And we did it, and it worked great. But then this is where we ran into issues. Then not everybody was logged on yet. And so I didn't want other people who had never done it to be logging on to a meeting that was being active in interpretation mode, because they wouldn't hear me until they picked a channel. And so then I would have to be instructing them without the benefit of their being able to hear me. And so I don't have it with me, it's back in my office, but I actually do have on a piece of paper, and there's other ways to do it. You can make it your profile picture and turn off your camera so that the screen shows whatever your instructions are, right? You can put it on a PowerPoint and screen share that so that it says, look for the globe icon, right? But what I did in one particular time was I just took a blank piece of paper, and with a Sharpie, I wrote, look for the globe icon, and I drew the globe and select English. And then I just held that up to the webcam as a means of communicating with somebody who can't hear me. And to avoid that, I said, okay, we're going to go ahead and shut this down, and then we'll reinitiate it when everybody is on. And so like 5 minutes later, everybody else, the attorneys, the claimant were on the Zoom call. And I said, okay, we're going to go ahead and launch this again. But the court reporter thought, because she had already done it once, she didn't need to do it again. And so everybody else was set up in their channels except her, and she was not hearing me. And so I was having to communicate with her through one of the attorneys, because there's, the Zoom simultaneous function has very specific rules about sound. The interpreter hears everything, but somebody who's not in a channel can hear the other participants, but not the interpreter. And so we got through it. We worked it out. But another example of an issue that we had was so my communication with clients about this at the very onset of it is where they say, we want to do a deposition on Zoom. And I say, great. What do you think about doing it simultaneously? These are the requirements. You have to connect from a computer. You have to have an updated version of Zoom. Ideally, you have to have a microphone. Everybody has to have their own device. And so that's just to get in the door. And if they say yes, then you go on to, okay, if I'm hosting, I'll say, okay, I'll make a link and I'll send it to you. And then the night before or the day before, you send out the actual instructions where you say, here's the link again. And again, a reminder, please connect from a computer with Zoom downloaded as a program on the computer, not a browser, because it will not work in a browser. It will not work in dial-in audio. And this is a preview of what you're going to be looking for. This is the globe icon that you're going to need to be able to listen. And so I try to keep it succinct because there are 20 other things that I could talk to them about as far as RSI best practices. Make sure you have a nice backdrop. But I need to really focus on the essentials so that they actually do it. And so the issue we ran into there was I never actually got confirmation from the parties that we were going to do Zoom simultaneous. And so I had it set up in case, but I never got confirmation from the claimant's attorney that they were going to have access to 2 devices or that they were going to put the claimant in another room. And so actually, because the defense attorney who was doing the questioning was late, we were on and able to do the tech setup. And so we were good on that end, except they were in the same room and only one of them had microphones. And so I was getting my own sound echoing out and getting caught by the headphone mic that the claimant was using. So that was not ideal. But the issue that we had, what ultimately tripped us up in getting it going, was because we never got really officially a green light, I wasn't able to send out that email ahead of time saying, you need to connect from a device, you need to have it downloaded, this is what the icon looks like. We were having to do that all on the fly. And the court reporter, we found out, was trying to connect from Zoom through a browser, which does not work for interpretation. And so they had to get out of it. Well, first we had to figure out what the problem was, because if all they're saying is, I don't see the globe, I don't see the globe, I've got to think through, okay, what could it be? And then eventually we landed on, they didn't actually have the program downloaded, they were just connecting through the browser. And so it's a double-edged sword that you can get on Zoom through so many different platforms and devices, because as a listener, it's wonderful. I could get in the car right now and talk to you and still have video on the ride home. But for purposes of interpretation, it's difficult when 2 of the 5 don't work for interpretation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right. I mean, the amount of reading that people do is really limited, and they say just put the least possible. But they're not going to read everything, so it really has to just be and then you always have like all of us, people who have used it, and so they're going to like apply their own knowledge to it and not really read as well. And I'm one of those people, well, I know how to do this, and so I'm not going to read it because I think this is for someone who doesn't know, and then really miss an important step, because
even the same court reporting firm that I had this issue with they were trying to log on from the browser. The same firm that hired me for that depot wanted me for another depot next month and said, oh no, the court reporters will set up the Zoom meeting. And I said, no, this is Zoom simultaneous, and we've established that, this is not something that they were familiar with. And so if it's okay with you, I'll set it up. Because again, it's a little bit more work for me, but it's a little bit more work for me to have to troubleshoot everybody's tech when we're in the deposition. And so if a little bit more work now in creating a meeting is going to save me the 10-minute delay getting everybody set up the day of, I'll take that.
Yeah, and and ultimately it's better for your client too. They'll be happier, and it's just better for the whole language access process too, without that all that frustration.
And that's how I pitch it. I'm trying to remember where in my social media that I posted for this screenshot of the mediation, I said ensuring safe and reliable language access while socially distancing.
Yeah.
Something like that. The actual text of it is going to be in the posts, but something to that effect. And that's how you can pitch it to the clients as well. Because from the client side, simultaneous is great because they get out of there in half the time. And so I know some interpreters really don't care for depositions being done simultaneously. They think that's the interpreter's showcase, that's the interpreter's opportunity to really show off their great consecutive skills. And I will say this, consecutive is my favorite thing to do. It absolutely is and I think it's the strongest of the 3 skills for me. But I still, in this particular instance, I'll take getting done sooner.
Yeah. Okay. So you told me you already answered some of my questions here. I think we can start wrapping up. This was really good. I think I might start with yours just in the series because there's so many details about how to do it, which people are so hungry for right now and really need. So thank you for all that.
And I will say this, I don't know if this is relevant, but I wanted to piggyback on this. The experimentation I've been doing specifically with Zoom, less so with the other, I call them pirate solutions, where you're doing sort of hybrid systems. It's not just something that I've been learning for myself. From the way that I learned Zoom was collaboratively with other interpreters. And within 2 or 3 weeks, I was on a session with Liz and Laura, walking them through it, because I think Liz had a session or a job that week in Zoom simultaneous. And so that instruction teaches me. Every time I do a demo for Zoom with other colleagues, I learn something different, even if it's through something that doesn't go right in that session. And so we have a 500-person session tomorrow for Arizona that's sold out because it's free in part, and it's also going to be live streamed. And so it means a lot to me to be able to take the skill set that I have with the platform and my training teaching skill set and be able to share it to help other colleagues.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. So let's finish off with the idea of talking about what you do and why you love it, and how is that a part for you in terms of when you think about your career in general. How much is it connected to loving what you do, or do you just do it for a living?
I was really blessed to discover interpreting. I part of me wishes I had discovered it earlier in life. If I had discovered this if I had discovered this, for example, during undergrad, I would not be here right now. I would have gone and gotten a master's in conference interpreting, and who knows, but I doubt I would be a court interpreter here in Des Moines, Iowa. And so part of that, is something that I wonder about, but I also embrace what's been my path and understand that everything I did before interpreting, I now bring to bear. I was a teacher before being an interpreter. And so that's a skill set that I can still use in the training that I do. And so I like to say that interpreting as a career was sort of inside of me the whole time. It just needed to come out, because every job that I had before working as an interpreter, I still was using my 2 languages, that skill set. And so it was, once I got into it, right away, I pretty much knew this is going to be something that I really want to run with. This is going to be something that I really want to invest in and try to see where I can get with, because it was like a light bulb moment where I said, well, I've been bilingual most of my life, and I've been using this in all of these jobs. And so take away everything else and just have it be the interpreting, the translating. And right away, I really took to it. And it is a constant intellectual challenge. Every day I get to learn something new. By working freelance, every day is a little bit different. And the colleagues that I've met are wonderful and inspiring, talented people who've made me better as a person and a professional.
That's great. Okay, so let's do the lightning round
Okay.
finale here. And some people didn't get these ahead of time, so you're good there. More pressure.
I didn't read it. I only remember 2 or 3 of them, so we'll
good.
see.
So do you is it a notepad or a digital pad? Nice.
Digital.
Which one is?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not okay. It is not pen and paper. It's sort of digital. It's a boogie board, which is a pretty primitive. It doesn't have a memory. You can't scroll on it. It doesn't have apps. Like literally, it works like a magnet-doodle.
Right, I've heard of that. And you're my first interviewee so far to use a digital one. But I've heard of the boogie boards because they're very
I don't know. I mean,
inexpensive and kind of.
Yeah. I mean, it just literally. I use it because it saves me having to go and buy legal pads in bulk. And so, we were talking before about the definitions of like, what is RSI? What is OPI? Is this really digital if it doesn't have pixels, if it doesn't operate through a code of ones and zeros? And so I guess this would be like hybrid, which is perfect, right? Because I do hybrid stuff in court.
That's right. What about your beverage? Is it hybrid too? Your caffeine, is it coffee or tea?
If I'm going to have it, I generally prefer tea because, which just, is sacrilege for a Colombian. But
I was
yeah,
gonna
tea.
say.
I also like. It's not caffeinated, but I like kombucha too if I'm gonna have something other than water.
Yeah, one of my good Brazilian friends and colleagues doesn't drink coffee, and so yes, you know it's the same thing. It's like, how can you not?
I just find it makes me really jittery, you know, and so I fall into the trap occasionally. I forget what the effect is that coffee has on me. So I think I've got a lot to do. I need to be sharp, and so I'm going to drink a cup of coffee to keep me focused, right? But sometimes that just means I get really focused on a distraction.
Good point. What about for language learning? Do you think you're a visual learner or ear learner?
It's probably against the rules, but I would say a little bit of both. I like to have auditory input, but I write it down. And so, for example, for studying for the federal exam, which would have been, 7 years ago now, honestly, one of the best things I did was watch this Mexican, not exactly a soap opera, like a television drama about a woman's prison. And so I would watch it and I would, consume it audio visually, but taking down the words into my glossary and reviewing them in writing through note cards. So just like remote interpreting, it's important to have a integrated approach.
Do you have a special object or a totem that you take with you when you interpret?
Uh, Not permanently, but lately I have been carrying around a pen that I have that I like to twirl around my finger when I'm interpreting. And it's a very particular kind of pen because I can basically twirl it back and forth between my fingers continuously. And it's just a nervous tick that I developed back in debate in high school. So it helps me focus. And this is actually tangential to that, and you'll appreciate this because I know when we did Voice Boxer, you talked about mindfulness. Um, Something that I've actually started doing specifically here for the press conferences because it's conference is to ground myself and to not get sort of sucked into the message. I have an application on my phone called periodic vibration, which every 2 minutes vibrates my phone and it just forces me to kind of be in the moment and get out of the headspace of just, again, being sucked into the message, to remember, breathe. It matters how you deliver. Don't rush. And so usually I get so into it that I set it every 2 minutes. After the first one or two, I stop even noticing it. And so it wouldn't be bad if it could be upgraded to like a light electric shock or something that would get my attention a little bit more.
That's interesting. And so you basically you decide what that vibration means to you ahead of time. It's kind of like that vibration.
I mean, because like literally, it's a pretty simple app, and this is for Android. Literally, all it does is make your phone vibrate on an interval, and you can control how long the vibration is. And so you set it for half a second, or a second, or 2 seconds. And so that's something that I've been experimenting with. I'm going to turn it on here in a minute.
Yeah, there's the one for posture, and it does a similar thing. You stick it on your back, and then it'll buzz when you when you slouch.
Oh, really? That's how I've seen that, but I didn't know how it worked. That's neat.
I met an ASL interpreter that really liked it, and I think it goes here. I can't remember if it was here or here. Maybe you could choose, and then you tell it what is your ideal posture, and that if you deviate from it, it'll buzz.
Yeah, I could use that too.
Freelance or in-house?
Freelance. It's all I know. I think honestly, I wouldn't mind being in-house, but right now we're grounded here, and so there's no in-house positions really for what I want to do here, and so freelance by default. So I embrace that.
And you answered some of these already, but consecutive or simul?
Depends. Well, the ultimate interpreter translator answer, right? It depends. I would say simul for remote, consecutive for in-person back and forth, like a witness examination. Although I do, if I'm in front of a jury, I'm perfectly willing to, and in fact, sometimes seek out doing whatever, the labels vary, right? Consecutaneous, where you do the question in simultaneous into Spanish, and then the answer consecutively into English.
Is there an area or a term or a category of things that never seem to stick, so that you know ahead of time that you have to kind of prepare or write on a piece of paper, pay special attention, because if not, you might get it wrong?
I don't know about an area of like a whole lexical category, but I know here in my work with the press conferences, I've been having trouble with public-private partnership, not because it's a tongue twister in English, but just because in Spanish it's asociación público-privada. And so the gender mismatch between público and privada is hard for me. I think mentally it just like me choca a little bit. And so it's hard for me to get it out. And so I have that written down on a piece of paper so that I can look at it and just read it off the paper.
Yep. And can you name a favorite podcast?
I really like Crime Town and Radio Ambulante for practice with Spanish. It's excellent for vocabulary. And so going back to, for auditory or visual, and it's kind of a hazard because I love to listen to it in the car, but I have to stop and pull over to write down terms. And that's not hardcore technical terms, but just, nice turns of phrases and nice expressions that I don't have because I'm constantly looking to continue to build my vocabulary and my repertoire.
Mm-hmm. I know what you mean. I've done that when I'm listening or thinking about a job that's coming up, or I hear a term on the radio or something. And what I do is I do a voice memo on my phone, but it's safer to pull off the road. We'll just tell people to pull off.
I have, and I might still, it's washed off now, but I do have, last week I had some stuff on my hand just from where I would very quickly jot something on my hand, but I don't advise that. That's not recommended.
Well, thank you, Ernest, so much for your time. Thank you for this interview. I really appreciate it, especially sandwiched in between all your work. I'm going to definitely go check out the press briefing. And thank you. And I'll let you know when it's posted, which should be very soon. It's just now a matter of me editing it. So,
is that going to go up on your face? Let's see. The audio is going to go up on your whatever, iTunes and whatever, right?
Yeah. So that's what those are the last steps right now. So we're going to have a page on the Seven Sisters website for the podcast. And so then people can go to all the episodes there as they get dropped or, as they come out. Mm-hmm. And then we have to sign up with a distributor that distributes it to iTunes and all the things. And so I still mm-hmm. have to figure out the best one. And then, mm-hmm. Yep, and then
the video will be on your YouTube channel and
probably Facebook too. Yeah.
Cool. I'm friends with Liz on all of those. I'm gonna chat you my Twitter handle if you can just tag me when you guys do.
Oh yes.
Announce it. That's in the chat.
I know, and I'm gonna write it down on paper here. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really, really nice.
And one more thing, because of is it Murcia?
Niño-Murcia. Well, it depends. I mean, it depends if you're speaking English or Spanish. But if it's in English, I just say Niño-Murcia. But in Spanish, it's Niño-Murcia.
Murcia. Okay. Yeah. Not Murcia, but Murcia. Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. We'll have a good press briefing, and then you have the political debate. That's really exciting. Is that gonna be streamed live as well? It must be.
It's aired live, on TV, and then it is posted after the fact on YouTube.
Okay, cool. Well, good luck, and break a leg, because it's a performance, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Thanks, Elena. Bye-bye.